Good morning. Happy Tuesday. Hope you had a chance to get out into the sunshine yesterday. It was super nice outside. And that was really good for me to have a chance to be out in the sunshine a little bit. It's good for your mental health and your physical health. So I hope you are taking little breaks to be outside and a little bit active here and there. Make a big difference for you, I think. We're jumping into Southeast Asia. And yesterday, just wanted to give you a brief sense of the layout of the lands. We're going to get a little bit more detailed on the geography today and then get into the various cultures: Vietnam, Angkor, which is Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, Malaysia. And we're just going to try to sort of see what's true of those areas and how their civilizations developed. I'm not sure how many of them we'll get through today. I don't want to drone on and on. So maybe we'll do two or three of them today and then finish them up tomorrow. We'll see. The first one we're going to talk about, though, is first thing we're going to talk about is impact of geography. We're talking about Southeast Asia, which is sometimes called Indochina, because it is this landmass that is sort of situated to the south and east of China and India. In some ways, it could qualify as a subcontinent. Now, India is clearly a subcontinent, but this landmass that juts off might actually qualify itself, although it's not very big, and so people usually don't call it a subcontinent. But it is definitely a distinct area. It has peninsulas coming off of it, archipelagos, which are groups of islands. Um, there are several north-south mountain ranges. If you go into Vietnam or into northern Cambodia or into Thailand, there's these mountain ranges. Those mountains themselves are densely forested, and there's actually a few areas that you would call jungle in Southeast Asia, into Burma in particular. And a lot of people point out that this means that this area, even though it's pretty small, is pretty disjointed. It was never fully unified. And they say maybe that's because of the physical features of it, keeping it separate this way. And this actually maybe is the reason why there are so many distinct cultures in Southeast Asia, despite the fact that they're so close together. And so we're going to be talking about the distinct cultures, Vietnam first. But what we want to maintain is an understanding that part of the reason they're distinct is the physical features of the area keep them distinct. So let's talk about Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is actually one of the first cultures to develop in the area in Southeast Asia, and they have always maintained a very powerful sense of identity and even independence, which is interesting because there have been large portions of their history where they've been dominated by others. China is one example. Into modern times, France controlled Vietnam, and then Japan controlled Vietnam. But they were fiercely independent in their sense of identity, and that actually made them hard to conquer and subjugate over the years. Um, they were always sort of on the brink of an independence movement, and they resisted fiercely when the Japanese invaded during World War II, and obviously the Vietnam War shows their fierce independent mindedness and capacity for struggle. And so that's an interesting aspect of the Vietnamese culture. Now, China was able to conquer them, and while it took a long time, they actually stayed in control for a long time. Um, they took about 100 years to try to subjugate Vietnam, but eventually did in 111 BC. But the Vietnamese remained difficult to control and rule during that time, despite the fact that the Chinese had control for about 1,000 years. Now, the Vietnamese overthrow the Chinese and then sort of take on a Chinese style of government, which they called the Dai Viet. Um, so their government had, things like civil service exams, and they organized it aristocratically, kind of like the Chinese did. I think by now you're starting to realize the Chinese are very impactful. We saw their impact on Korea and on Japan and now Vietnam. Eventually, Vietnam will actually expand to the south and to the west and have what you might think of as a kingdom for a while before the French will eventually come to control the area. But the Vietnamese are a comparatively powerful group of people in the meantime. Um, they're going to have rivals, and we're about to talk about who those rivals are. But the main takeaway from the Vietnamese I want you to see is they're just fiercely independent, despite the historical fact that they were controlled by other groups. One of the groups that they become a bit of a rival with is Angkor, although some of this rivalry doesn't really develop until the modern era. Angkor is what is today Cambodia, and it's one of the things that Cambodians are actually most proud about is their history of this very, very powerful kingdom, probably the leading kingdom in Southeast Asia for a few centuries. It arises in the 800s under a king named Jayavarman, and there will be other Jayavarmans to follow, but he was situated as a god king. And so there's a worship of king and the gods in Angkor. Now, the Angkor group actually started off as being animistic, worshiping spirits, and then develop Hinduism. And then actually, the longer they last, you see they start to transition towards Buddhism. And it's interesting. You can see that in their building projects. One of the world's greatest sites, archaeological sites, is Angkor Wat, which means Angkor Temple. And you can actually see in the carvings of the temple how they transition, because they built the temple over hundreds of years. So you could see the different things that they focus on actually note their transitions religiously. The capital of the Angkor kingdom was called Angkor Thom, and the people themselves were called, we would say Khmer, but they say Khmer in Cambodia. Khmer is pronounced Khmer. And like I have said, this kingdom, the Angkor kingdom and the Khmer people, are going to be the most powerful group in Southeast Asia for several hundred years. The Angkor, while they do have a rivalry with Vietnam for a while, their bitter enemy, the one that they focus on in their sort of stories and culture, is the Thai. Even today, there's a bit of a rivalry. They actually fire rockets back and forth across the border from time to time. There's not a huge war, but it's almost like how things are with Israel and Palestine, where there's just always tension. The rise of the Thai people, though, will actually lead to the decline of the Angkor people. But there's wars, and there's lots of time in the meantime that they both coexist. So Thailand is actually going to first appear out of the 500s. These people on the frontiers of China are pushed out of China, move southward, and this picks up the pace when we get to the Mongol invasion. So when you look at Thailand, especially northern Thailand, the people there you're seeing are people who migrated out of China, and they're often called hill tribes. And so they migrated out of China and into Thailand, and some of them into northern India and where today is Nepal and Bhutan. So you can see a sort of uniformity of people groups from about Cambodia through Thailand over to India, of these hill tribes coming down out of China, Burma included in that. When they are in what is today Thailand, they begin to take on some of the religious identities of the area. They're influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism, which shouldn't surprise us because they're closer to India, and that's where both of those religions began. If it's right to call Buddhism a religion, it's maybe more of a philosophy. But that being said, they are influenced by India. They begin to take on Indian political practices and cultural practices. Now, if you went there today, you would see a significant difference. Thailand is a very reserved culture. They seem more like Northern Asia than their neighbors do. Cambodia is very warm and affectionate culture. Been there several times. And India, obviously a very kind of vibrant, loud place. But Thailand is very reserved, quiet, kind of like you would expect Japan and China to be. So that's an interesting contrast there, given the fact that historically they are quite influenced by India. Then if you traveled to the north and to the west of Thailand, you would hit Burma. and they're an enemy of the Thai. And what you see is that these people had actually migrated down out of Tibet. Same kind of deal, same hill tribes out of Tibet because of the Chinese armies in this case. Initially, they were pastoral, meaning they had flocks of sheep and goats and things like that, but then they adopt farming and settle in this area of Burma. And they established a kingdom, what was called at the time Pagan. They influence their influence includes India, and they convert to Buddhism. Um, and one of the things that actually helps them grow in power is that they were at a crossroads, sort of between China and India, and uh, from the Middle East into Southeast Asia. And being at this crossroads was very helpful to them financially, helped them grow in power. But eventually that power is going to slip away from them because of the Mongol invasion. The Mongolians keep showing up, huh? And so the invasion of the Mongols is one of the reasons Burma becomes a lesser power in the area. Last one is the Malay world. The Malay Peninsula is one aspect of that, this peninsula that comes down off of Thailand, but then also they have this influence over the Indonesian archipelago, which is a group of islands. So you would think of that all being the Malay world. For a long time, because it's groups of islands and because it's a peninsula, there was no one power. Eventually, there will be two groups that kind of come up out of that. Srivijaya and Sailendra are both going to kind of coalesce, and one's more focused on trade. The Strait of Malacca is Srivijaya, and one's going to be more focused on farming towards the eastern end of the main island there of Java. And Sailendra is going to be known for farming. But eventually there'll be a kingdom that comes out of that called Mahapahit. And Mahapahit is going to kind of dominate for a while until the Muslim kingdom comes along. And it's this Islamic kingdom that has the most historical influence because the area is very much Muslim, one of the most densely populated Muslim areas in the world. We usually think of the Middle East, but actually the majority of Muslims don't live in the Middle East. They live in Southeast Asia here in the Malay area, and other places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. So this Islamic State is going to come along and really control the whole area. It's one of the first times that the whole area is going to be controlled. And they set up a state called Malacca, which was initially just a trading port and a city, but it grew in influence as trade became more and more important into the modern era. And they came to control the whole region, and so have just really important influence. So today we've talked about Vietnam and their independent mindedness, the Angkor, powerful kingdom from the 800s into like the 1200s, a little bit further. We talked about Thailand and the way it's interesting in its influences from China and India. Talked about Burma and now the Malay world. And what we've noticed is that these places are distinct. They share similarities, but they're distinct. And that is probably due to the fact that it's such a disjointed area with peninsulas and archipelagos and mountain ranges and jungles, and it makes it so that there can't be really a unified culture there. I hope you have a great day. Enjoy your Tuesday.